Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles and Leadership series. My name is Daryl Lim. I serve as the H. Lady Montague Junior Chair and Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the Law School. This series offers an unparalleled opportunity to glean insights from top leaders who serve in government, education, the private sector, and civil society. In each episode, we invite leaders to reflect on their journeys and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. We're very pleased to have Robert B. Ahdieh, Dean, and Anthony G. Buzbee, Endowed Dean's Chair at Texas A&M University School of Law. He's also the Vice President for Professional Schools and Programs, Texas A&M-Fort Worth, Chief Operating Officer, Texas A&M University. A graduate of Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and Yale Law School, Dean Ahdieh served as law clerk to then Chief Judge Jim Browning of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit before his election for the Honors Program in the Civil Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. While still in law school, Dean Ahdieh published what remains one of the seminal treatments of the constitutional transformation of post-Soviet Russia, Russia's constitutional revolution, legal consciousness, and the transition to democracy. His scholarly interests revolve around questions of regulatory and institutional design, especially in the financial arena. His particular focus has been on various non-traditional regulatory structures and modes of regulation, including those grounded in dynamics of coordination. Welcome.
Thank you, Daryl. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, you are the Dean of the Law School at Texas A&M. So people tell me the Dean is the personification of the law school. Why don't we start by telling our listeners three things that you'd like them to know about Texas A&M?
Thank you. I'm happy to. Again, it's been the kind of honor of my career to be the dean here at Texas A&M School of Law. As of the dean being the personification, I suspect it might depend on the day. Whether the school or the faculty or the students want the dean to be the personification. But I will say three things that probably are worth highlighting for listeners who aren't familiar. The law school has been on this rather incredible trajectory the last 10 years or so. In the summer of 2013, it had been Texas Wesleyan School of Law, part of Texas Wesleyan University, a small liberal arts college here in Fort Worth, Texas, and was acquired by A&M, and A&M invested heavily in it. And it has seen in that period of time the fastest and furthest rise of any law school in terms of rankings and the like ever, really. What's exciting about that is that it's not just a numbers game. It's not smoke and mirrors. It really is a reflection of fundamental quality improvements here at the law school. And that's, maybe the two others I'll mention is the people. First, the amazing students we have. So the caliber of student has increased dramatically, even as we've maintained diversity of the student body and also maintained the character of the student body as students who are really in law school for the right reasons, because they want to have a positive impact and who are not coming here because of rank alone, but because of who we are as an institution and our core values. And then in turn, faculty that we've recruited more than 40 faculty over the last 8 or 9 years, most of them coming at the time they came from a higher ranked school, in many cases giving up chairs that they held at those other schools. Why? Because they were excited about being part of a building project. They were excited about being part of building a new institution. And in that sense, we've got this incredible faculty community that matches up with the incredible student community. And all of that collectively is what's driving our success in terms of ranking and reputation and so on and so forth.
Wonderful. Now, what's the most common concern or objection you have when you approach prospective faculty and say, come join us in Texas A&M? And they say, well, that sounds wonderful, but, and then.
Yeah, so the but oftentimes is Texas, and obviously, Texas has a reputation, some of it earned, some of it well-deserved, some of it not. I do tell folks that it is always good to go further than just scratching the surface. My version of it is that I say, if you rely on headlines in the New York Times for your information about what Texas is like, you have a very, skewed impression. That said, there are real political dynamics in Texas that there are many who, perhaps rightly so, find distressing and find unattractive in terms of a place to be a student, a place to be a faculty member, a place to raise a family, and the like. And so we do our best to engage them and talk about, the balance of equities of sorts in terms of the advantages that Texas and Texas A&M offers, but also acknowledge readily that where a faculty member or a student doesn't feel like they can find a safe, comfortable, welcoming home in Texas, then we're not the right place, because obviously that's what we want for our faculty, for our staff, for our students. And so that's probably the biggest pushback we get.
Thanks. In your office, there's a shovel. Can you tell us a bit about the shovel and what that represents?
Sure. I'll give maybe a little bit of the backstory, because itself it may be interesting for your listeners for the audience in terms of kind of leadership. So I had never been, in years of being a faculty member and then an academic administrator at Emory, where I was before, I had never been particularly focused on physical construction, physical space and physical building. In fact, I used to say, if you just give me 10 solid, well-made yurts and the right faculty and students, I could give you a top law school. Because again, to me, the physical space wasn't the imperative. When I arrived at A&M, even as we had this aspiration to significantly raise the profile of the school thus, my view was that even though we were occupying and still occupy as of today, a former Southwest Bell switching station, two-story, kind of relatively unattractive building that was reconfigured for use as a law school. But even then, I thought, look, my job will be to move the place up in terms of quality of faculty, quality of students, quality of programs, reputation, ranking. And then my successor can get the glory of opening new buildings and cutting ribbons and so on and so forth, because it wasn't really my priority. I realized quickly, though, that on the Fort Worth side of the ledger, there was keen interest in A&M being a more visible presence in the community. And on the A&M side of the ledger, there was a real opportunity to create a platform, not for the law school, but for the broader university in North Texas, because the law school is located about 170 miles away from the main campus. So to create a platform for the broader university in engineering, in agri-life and agriculture and health sciences that it hadn't had. And so at the intersection of those began to dialogue both on the Fort Worth community side and the Dallas-Fort Worth community side, I should say more broadly, and then on the A&M side about, is there something more ambitious and broader that we can do beyond a shiny new law school building? In fact, the line I used at the time was, I said, if all I accomplish as dean of the law school is building a big shiny new building, I will have failed as dean. So that shovel in my office is from the groundbreaking on the first of what will ultimately be 3 buildings that we are building that will constitute an innovation campus that will bring together not just academic programs, but industry partners who will co-locate on the campus, all with a focus on innovation and technology and entrepreneurship. So that's what the shuttle represents, is this kind of long arc of moving folks from, we don't really need a new building, but it would be nice, to building this whole new campus for the university that we hope will be transformative, not just for A&M, but really for the entire Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex.
So when you talk about moving folks, I mean, you have made tremendous progress in a very short amount of time. For some folks that are incumbents, that are more used to a different pace of life, it
Sure.
can feel like whiplash. How do you manage that change with them?
It occurred to me, actually, it's funny you said it, because I was just this morning thinking about where I fall short, or where, as a leader, I have underperformed. And I wasn't actually thinking about it in the context of this podcast. I was thinking about it more generally, like where are the areas that I have strength and weakness kind of thing. And I realized that one of them is my patience for, we're here, it's all good, let's just stick with it, is very low. My patience for doing it your way versus my way, infinitely high. In other words, if we are moving, if we are making progress from my vantage, I don't have any robust sense that my vantage and perspective and views on that are superior to yours or anyone else's. But my resistance, you could say it this way, to inertia is very high. So then how do you get around that? How do you engage that? One is you're more patient, right? You have to develop the skill of recognizing that folks will get there in their own time. And also be patient in the sense of accepting that not everyone has to get there at the same time. In other words, don't overestimate the degree to which everyone has to be in full understanding and agreement. Incompletely theorized agreement sometimes is the best secret to progress, right? We agree enough that we can move forward, kind of thing. In terms of how you engage individuals, obviously there's an element of self-interest, right? So again, what are the ways in which there is both carrot and stick? There is carrot and less stick in path X versus path Y. So I think oftentimes that can be helpful. But for me, the biggest one is always vision. It's if you can define a vision, that it's got to be sufficiently aspirational that it uplifts people or attracts people. It's also got to be sufficiently concrete that people can see themselves within it and see the benefits of it for them. That's not a self-interested thing. It's just the nature of the human condition that when we evaluate things, we ask, well, help me understand it from where I sit. If we can define that kind of a vision, and I think that's really what we have been able to do, and I hope I've contributed to at the law school and in terms of this new campus we're building, is again, setting that vision that's aspirational, but also sufficiently concrete that it draws people in. But I don't want to understate where I started. You also have to be very patient.
So in exercising that patience and judgment, do you see really perhaps three different buckets of faculty at Texas A&M? You've got the folks that were there when Texas A&M was Texas Wesleyan. You've got the folks that joined after Texas A&M took over, but it was a really different school, I suppose, in a sense back then, because you weren't in the top 30. And then now you are in the top 30 and you're attracting a different type of faculty. So is there a market segmentation in terms of how you deal with them?
So I'm going to give an answer that I think is empirically true, but it would be the view I would counsel from a leadership perspective, regardless. I don't really sort them into those buckets. There's such variation within each of the buckets that for me, I probably would sort them into buckets of those who are 100% with the program and energetic and enthusiastic to advance it, those who appreciate the program, but are, whether as a matter of temperament or enthusiasm or time, are kind of, and then there's the group that is kind of at some level suspicious of the vision, right? And so I think of this as a leader, as you are trying to, maybe with all things, you're trying to move people up that projection or I'm almost like salmon jumping up a dam, from one level to the next one. And it's not that at any given moment you're going to eliminate a category or whatever, but as you are progressively able to move people further and further up that ladder, you're able to accomplish more. And I think that's been the secret here. Obviously, recruiting faculty and energizing faculty so that they're 100% on board and they're excited about what it will mean for them to be at a, again, if I say go back a year, at a top 30 school. Today, I would say at a top 25 school. Soon I'll say at a top 20 school, right? So you want to grow that group by moving people up that chain and recruiting. And then the middle group, obviously, again, they're with the program at some level. You want them to be that much more committed to it, right? That much more into it. And that's where incentives and rewards and so on and so forth can play an important tool. Because for that group, you're not trying to sell them on the vision. You are trying to get them to sort of invest that much more in it. And so those kinds of incentives and tools can be helpful in that regard. And I think more carrot than stick is my general view. Finally, the last group, again, obviously, again, same principle applies in terms of trying to move them. I also think that's where it may be important in part for an effective leader to be able to say, that's okay, right? As much as we want as individuals, and perhaps particularly as leaders, to get everyone on board, for everyone to appreciate the benefits. It may also be that at a certain point you say, and it's not that you write them off, it's that you say, it's okay, it's consistent with are forward advanced, that if you have two large buckets, or even, the buckets will be different sizes, if 80 or 90% of your faculty is, with the program either and actively, or with the program and somewhat engaged, that may be sufficient. So with that group, again, I think you've got to engage. It's important as a matter of community for them to feel like they have the opportunity to embrace the vision and be part of it, but also important to acknowledge that that as a dean, or as in any leadership role, you also have to accept the fact that some people may be where they are and they're comfortable where they are, and as a matter of carrying their portion of the weight, they will be able to do that even if they're not at one of those further stages of the ladder.
So when you talk about forward advance, there's always a cost to advancing. And as the leader of the school, you've got to weigh the pros and cons. You talked about top 20 as perhaps the next step. What are some of the costs that you've seen in moving the school up to this point? And what is the sky the limit? Is the goal to go as far as the school can go with whatever trade-offs that you're willing to make?
So first thing I'd say is as your empirical question of what is the goal, I would say, and again, and I've come to embrace the ways of the Texas Aggie. They are not a group that ever starts with the assumption that something is out of reach. I've said on occasion that all of us are born with a natural sense of our limitations. We know we're capable of A, B, C, but we'll never accomplish X, Y, and Z, except for the Aggies. I don't know what it is. I said they drink something, they eat something. But for their vantage, there is no goal that is impossible, or at least that they start with the assumption that it's impossible. So where they will go, we'll see. I tend to take it in bite-sized pieces. That this is what we're doing today. Once that's done, we can have a conversation about the next piece, and then go from there. In terms of the cost, obviously there's a financial cost, and that's not, I don't mean to be glib about that. It's a significant financial cost for any institution to do more than or better than it's doing now. In this context, it's a substantial cost. But when I think about cost, it's not it costs this much. It's an opportunity cost. It's what else would you be doing with that time and resources? And I will say, I have that conversation with the university leadership all the time. I have on occasion said that I represent one half of the first time in the history of higher education in which a dean and a president had a big fight, and the fight was over money, and the dean was arguing for less money. Why? Because from my vantage, I was pressing and saying, you understand that there's an opportunity cost, that if you're spending it on this, you're not spending it on something else. Now, as concluded, the president told me, everything you say makes sense. The only problem with your argument is that you're the dean and I'm the president. So we are where we are for that. And I'm grateful, I should emphasize, to the university for that support. But there's the money cost of it. But let's talk about some of the other ones, because I think in some ways they're equally interesting. So one goes to what we were talking about. Part of a community is that everyone feels like they have a place within it. There's a risk in this that you leave people behind. My view of that is that I think that can be managed more so than we commonly acknowledge. There is a tendency, and it's probably true in every discipline, in every industry, in every field, but I know in higher education, and I know in legal education, we are very quick to attach normative value to I'm this versus I'm this versus I'm this, to attach normative value to I did this versus this versus this. From my vantage, no dean, no president, no provost can do their job, and probably no CEO, without folks doing a broad range of things, all of which are critically important to the advance of the institution. I'm not sure I do it effectively, to be fair, but at least what I try to do is to make sure that in this ever advancing community, there is still place for those who are doing things that are different, things that are important, but not the coin of the realm of where we are now. That can be difficult. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm sure I don't always do it effectively, and we don't always do it effectively. But I think that, again, the closer you can get to that mark, the better off you are in terms of minimizing those costs of progress. So that would be one thing I would say. The second one I would say is, in terms of students, it is the case that success in high school, success in college, success on standardized tests can breed a certain mindset in students and young people that I think is not healthy. I don't think there's a one-to-one correlation. We all know incredibly brilliant people who simultaneously manage to be humble, incredibly, sharp folks who nonetheless are able to sort of engage in dialogue and conversation and build relationships of meaning and the like. But there is probably a correlation between those problematics and academic success. So as we are recruiting better and better students in terms of academic credentials, I meet with the admissions office. I mean, I meet with them constantly, but probably once every 2 to 3 months to have some conversation around what are the things that we are doing to try and ensure that the students coming into our community remain students who are excited to be here and are excited again about the core values of the university and the law school, excited to help build this community. Can we do that perfectly? Of course not. It's an imperfect science to evaluate these things. This is why we enter into relationships and end them, because we realize we made a mistake. But I do think that's a cost, right? Is that if you are not attentive to that, there is a real danger that the price of going from here to here is you not lose your soul, sounds overly dramatic, but you lose your character, right? You lose your culture, you lose your community. And so I would say that's probably an important element as well. Maybe I'll say one other one. It is, I went to Yale Law School, and there were faculty there who had been there dating back to before the U.S. News rankings started. And occasionally one or another of them would say they hated the rankings. And we students would think, like, how is that possible? Like, Yale Law School has been #1 from the day one. How could they hate the rankings? And the response they would always give was something to the effect of, before the rankings came out, you had to actually say, I want to go to school at Yale Law School, even though it's in New Haven. I want to go to school at Yale Law School, even though it's got this kind of very quirky curriculum, right? You have to be affirmatively making choices that said, this is the place for me. Once it was #1, some significant portion of students said that. So that may be something else to guard against. It's a species of the last point that I made about who the students are, but this is not really who the students are. It's how they choose, right? And again, we want to continue to, I think, encourage students to think holistically about where do you want to be a student, not just what's the highest ranked school that you got into.
Thanks. You talk about not just competing in the state of Texas, but you want to compete with the state of California. What does that mean?
So what I've taken to saying, and again, it's one of these, as a dean, you always worry that there are things that you believe, but are also convenient, right? And so you psychoanalyze yourself to try and evaluate, like, am I just saying it out of expedience or convenience, or do I really? But I think I really believe this one. Texas is incredibly fast growing, population-wise, business growth, so on and so forth. Against that backdrop, from my vantage, the real issue for any law school in Texas is not competing with other law schools in Texas, right? Because there is the pie, as my expression I use is, the pie is growing so fast that if each law school in Texas only ate their growing portion of the pie, they would throw up, right? It's too much pie, right? Okay, given that, I don't think any of us, but I know that I don't think of it as we're competing with law school X versus Y versus Z in the state of Texas. Instead, we're competing with the state of California. So if you look at the rankings, in the rankings, California has 2 top law schools. Texas has none. I'm sorry, 2 top 10 law schools. Texas has none. Texas has, California has, I believe, 4 law schools in the top 20, and Texas has 1. In the top 30, 40, California has 5 or 6, and Texas has 2. That to me is a problem for a fast-growing state that wants to be kind of a business hub, a business center. So from my vantage, if all goes well, every law school in Texas should receive the support and the investment to be able to get better. I know what A&M is doing to get to that end, but other law schools, University of Texas, SMU, University of Houston, Baylor, St. Mary's, South Texas, UNT, Texas Southern, they all should also see, Texas Tech I didn't mention, they should also see that progress and should have the opportunity to grow, because that's what will ultimately make Texas successful. And if Texas is successful, each of our law schools will be successful as well. And I think that's a general, let me rephrase it. there are competitive circumstances which are zero sum, right, where there's significant contraction. But I think far more competitive situations among institutions are non-zero sum, are all ships rise situations than we commonly acknowledge. It's easier to think of it as I win if you lose, right? It takes a little more complexity to see the all ships rise pattern, but I think it's probably much more common than we ordinarily acknowledge.
Thanks. So, what are three things that people should know about you?
Me personally?
Yep.
Let's see. Maybe starting from, I'm the child of Iranian immigrants who left Iran to come to the United States to escape religious persecution. They were in school, but because they're members of the Baha'i faith, is our religion, they weren't given the same kinds of opportunities there in Iran. And so they came to the United States for their studies. My mother in medicine, and my father in higher education administration, ultimately. And so that really has shaped who I am and my values and worldview in many, many ways. In terms of how I think about, obviously, issues of religion and immigration and things, but also my worldview of the opportunities that the United States offers and has offered to my family and obviously so many others. That might be one that I would mention. Maybe related to that is the importance of family to me. My wife, we have three children, two boys who are biologic children, and then daughter that we adopted from Taiwan when she was 8 months old, is now 11 years old, and has been in Texas now for more than half of her life, and is commonly described by folks at A&M as the first Asian American governor of Texas. Even though she's only 11, because she loves Texas, she loves the rodeo, she loves football, she loves everything about the place, and so has really embraced the ways of Texas. So probably my family then would be number two, and then that then relates to maybe a third one, which is I think I'm probably the most New York Texan and the most Texan New Yorker in the country. At this stage, after 6 years here and 6 years spent kind of really embracing the ways of Fort Worth, the ways of Texas, I've become a little bit of a Texan, even though the New Yorker in me isn't far below the surface. And conversely, again, I'll talk to the Texans and say, "You're from New York, aren't you?" Because again, they know that's there, even though I've got a lot of Texan in me.
Thanks. So I want to unpack each of those three things because there's so much to talk about there. So let's start with your parents. So you're son of immigrants. Your dad has a fascinating background story. And one of the things is, of course, he thought that he was going to come to the US, to Harvard University, to study nuclear engineering. And then turned out it was Harvard University. And there were so many things that he did along the way, but each of them struck me as he was an incredibly entrepreneurial person. You went to Princeton, graduated from Yale, and now you're the dean of the law school that really everybody's talking about. What are your conversations like with him as you reflect on his journey and yours?
Wonderful. So first, we're father and son, so we fight. Obviously, X percentage of the time. So I don't want to be overly rosy about it. So I actually oftentimes think about it in the context of my father, in that he came first to the United States. They came before my parents were married. So he came first to the United States, came by himself, had no family. Ultimately, he brought his whole family with him, but he came by himself in his late teens. He came to the United States, as you said, thought he was applying to Harvard University, but had applied to Howard University. And then ended up, piecing together his education across a number of institutions, ultimately getting his PhD, and entering into higher education administration. So again, oddly enough, a parallel. He was an associate dean at Fordham University when I was a young boy, although ultimately he went on to do other things. But he really kind of broke new ground. And I think of that as I hope a piece of what he instilled in me, or what I learned from him in many ways. But also again, laid the foundation for a radically different life for his children and in turn his grandchildren beyond. It is the case that, and it goes back to the immigrant piece. If not for religious bias and religious prejudice, my family likely would have remained in Iran. And think what a different path that might have produced. But because of that persecution and my father's response to it, and frankly, at some level, intolerance for it, or impatience with it, we might say, that then opened up doors. And I, not only educationally, Princeton, Yale, this kind of thing, but both my older sister and I, each ultimately secured high-level government security clearances. I at the Department of Justice, she at the CDC. Both became professors, she at Johns Hopkins in public health, me at Emory, and then at Texas A&M. In many ways, the opportunities, not just for us as a family, but for adding value and giving back to this country that adopted him, I think is significant. And we talk about that. And we talk about my father, we talk about kind of what that means generationally, because obviously my children grew up very differently. As a child, we didn't have much, when I was a child, we didn't have much money. The later years did, but not as a child. Whereas my children grew up with resources and with what they needed, at least for their education and so on and so forth. So learning from my father and my mother, how do you raise children in a way that even when those opportunities are there in front of them, they nonetheless value them. They nonetheless don't become unappreciative of the opportunities that they have presented to them. So that's probably some of our conversations that I have.
One of the things that your dad's also known for is his work with Harlem Prep. What does that mean to you?
Sure. Yeah. So I mentioned that we were Baha'is. So this is in the 1970s. A group of Baha'is in education got together with a group of Catholic nuns who were interested in education to create a new school in Harlem. And Harlem has now become gentrified in a very different way. But at the time, Harlem was not a. So I remember as a kid, when he would take me to the school with him, he kind of bundled me up and ran me inside in case there was a shooting or something happening outside. But they started a school that was a prep school. So the basic notion was they would move kids through the pipeline of high school to place them into college. I mean, that they had to graduate. In essence, the last step was to be placed into some higher ed educational opportunity. The kids that they brought to the program were kids who were high school dropouts for the most part, kids who were in gangs, kids who were playing basketball in the corner around Harlem, brought them to the school. This was the 70s reformed education model. So it was the open classroom space. And I remember again, as a kid, seeing this big open space where the learning was happening. And so my father was a teacher and then was the vice principal of the school. And it really was this incredible transformative institution. They took these kids who were in gangs, kids who dropped out of high school, and ultimately those folks go into significant positions in the private sector and even more so in the public sector. So another story of kind of how education creates these opportunities to give back and to have an impact. And for decades later, those graduates of that Harlem Prep school. So there too, again, for me, I see an example of at its best, not every day, I wish it was every day, but at its best, what hopefully I can do in higher education, hopefully all of us, you can do, I can do, we can all do in higher education, is to create those opportunities. And it doesn't have to be someone who's coming from here and they go here. It could be someone who's here and ends here, but the impact they have along that journey is significant and substantial. So that's in some ways the lesson of Harlem Prep that I take away.
Thanks. Let's spend a bit of time talking about your faith because it's something that's very central to your family. Certainly up several generations, at least to your great-great-grandfather, Mulla Abdu'l-Husayn. And your dad has a fascinating account of an exchange that he had with somebody that was an officer that was persecuting him, and he had asked this gentleman, "You are a sage," he says, "why, with all your knowledge and wisdom, and after a life of hard work, have you accepted this new faith and consented that your sons be killed and your wife captured?" And I want to rephrase that to you because I think in the age that we live in, faith is often seen as something of a relic of the past, and thinking enlightened people would leave their faith behind. And certainly you see that in the United States. But not only has your family kept the faith, you are very successful in the work that you do, including uh, Harlem Prep and then other areas. I'll leave you to talk more about that, but the core question here is why, again, as the officer said, with all your knowledge and wisdom and after a life of hard work, have you accepted this faith and all that comes with it?
So let me begin by saying that having grown up in a household in which there was, I think, reflected for me this, I'm going to call it harmony of science and religion is the phrase we oftentimes use as Baha'is. But I'll explain that a little more. In which it was displayed, there was no lack of commitment to education, no lack of commitment to reasoned discourse, no lack of commitment to understanding science and what it means for us. But all of that was against the backdrop of, or inflected with even, a sense of faith and belief. Having grown up in that environment, to me, I have never felt the tension of, obviously as a lawyer, as a law professor, as a law student before that, a deep commitment to reasoned, analytical, what does the evidence show kind of thing. And also the notion that there can be this unknowable dimension of our beliefs, of our views, of our worldview that also inflects and also shapes who you are and how you live. So again, it's the tension of we are in the business of knowing, of knowing all things, you could say, but also as someone of faith, accepting of the fact that there are things that are unknowable, that journey will never get us to that point. It turns out that that's not unique to my family or to me, of course. There are those who are incredibly successful as professors, as scientists, and who also have that sense of faith. So I will say again to begin, it always makes me nervous to think about these as sharply dichotomous. That is a little bit of a tension that we have created, right? In the sense that you must choose one or the other. So that's one piece that I would say in terms of my own upbringing and what that's meant for me. And I hope what I have instilled in my children as well. Second, I would say is that, there is, I think, the Baha'i perspective is that there are common truths in all religions. And I think among those common truths is this other regarding element, whether you frame that as an obligation to serve others and serve humanity, whether you frame it as an obligation to turn the other cheek, however you think about that value, to me, that's an important part of who I am. And I think it does good work. I don't want to get into the debate or discussion about without that, can you be a good person? Of course, I think you can be a good person without that. But I know that for me, my experience has been that the fact that I have a perspective on who I am in the world that is boxed in, it's limited by, there is this divine, global, broader set of values, does good work because it gives me perspective on things. It makes me able to say, okay, this didn't work, but that's okay, right? In the big picture, maybe that's the best thing. It makes it easier for me to motivate myself when I think like, oh my God, this is just so impossibly difficult. I'm not doing it for me. My cost-benefit calculus is not the amount of work I put in against the benefit I get. It's, do I believe that I am doing my duty to advance human civilization? If I'm doing it, it may show up today, it may show up tomorrow, it may show up never even, but I'm doing my part to do that. And maybe the last thing I'd say is that, and that really, I think it follows from that, is kind of a perspective on what we should expect of ourselves. So I tell people, I think I'm most days an okay father. And maybe occasionally flashes of good. But what I tell my kids is the one key thing that I expect of them, that I look to from them, is that they are achieving their potential to contribute to the world. And if their potential is to do job X, great. Go do job X, excel at that, give it your all, have the greatest impact you can have, and then go forth in peace, right? But if your potential is here, then don't be here, right? How that ties into me, people will oftentimes ask me, do you like being an administrator more than you like being a teacher and a scholar? And I always struggle with the question because I feel like that's not really, it's not a question I ask. I years ago sat there and said, I think I'm a pretty good teacher. I think I'm a pretty good scholar, but I think my comparative advantage is in academic administration. And if that's the case, then that's where I can have the biggest impact. If that's where my comparative advantage is. It's not that I don't miss those other things. It's not that I don't love them. It's not that I wouldn't be excited to go back to them. But when asking myself the question of how should I spend my time and devote my professional energies and direct my leadership, if this is where I can have the biggest impact, it's not that I'm giving up the thing I love. I love that, but I also love this because this is where I can have the biggest impact, right? So I think that's been a part of my faith too, is that's the metric I use for what motivates me to do X versus Y in significant part is grounded in this broader conception of why am I here and what it is that I should contribute while I'm around.
So at what point did you realize that it's not just the faith of your father, it's your faith? And connected to that, do you see that also clicking in your children?
Good. That's a good
Become their
question.
faith and not just your faith.
Yeah, good. So a couple of things. First, in the Baha'i teachings, there is an explicit concept of we call independent investigation of truth. So the notion is that you don't become a Baha'i because your parents were Baha'is. You have to actually, you're expected to independently investigate and evaluate and make the determination that this is what I accept, this is what I believe, this is what my belief. So I did that. My parents did that with me. We have done that, I hope, hopefully effectively with our kids as well, in terms of making sure that they're not simply, generationally adopting this is what went before. But now that doesn't mean that as Baha'is, and that doesn't mean that my parents and that we didn't kind of instill in them Baha'i values and teach them the Baha'i principles and so on and so forth. But it meant that there was ultimately the notion that upon maturity at the age of adulthood, that they would, as I did, kind of evaluate that. So I think for me, it was that. I think I had a long stretch of experience during which I was a Baha'i because my parents were Baha'i. But as I grew older in my teenage years, it's not even that I began to question, it's that I gained perspective. And I said, is this the path that to me is the right path for me in terms of being able to engage with, the notion of God, some divine being, my place in the world, so on and so forth, and reach that conclusion. But that came through a lot of exposure. I spent lots of time with friends who grew up in New York City who were Jewish, Christian friends, Muslim friends, so on and so forth, including going to services, so on and so forth. And not necessarily I was keeping notes to see, do I want to be this religion or that religion, but to try and tap into where is my soul leading me? Is it here or there? And with our kids, we tried to do the same. And I think it's the case. They're in their early 20s, late teens, and then 11-year-old. We're trying to do the same. And I think they are finding that similar path. But we also understand that, again, look, it will be the case that as they proceed through life, life is a winding journey in all respects, including that one. But I do think, again, that's important because the more we are adopting any belief system, whether it's a religious one or a political one or a social one, because it's what we were fed by our parents, the less work it does. It's not the less strong it is, because maybe it's okay that it's not strong, but the less work it does for us, because again, as I like your phrasing, Daryl, it's not ours, it's somebody else's.
Thanks. Let's talk about your book, Russia's Constitutional Revolution. I was pleasantly surprised as I looked into it that I learned it was published by Penn State
Yeah, that's right.
Press. So there's that connection there. But also, we seem to be, in a sense, confronting Russia in a way that we did back when you wrote the book. Do you think there are lessons that we can draw from your book that might be applicable today?
I would like to say yes. Let me frame a little bit. As the 1990s progressed and into the aughts, into the 2000s, Progressively, those who had been engaged with the Soviet Union and Russia dating back to the early 90s, with great optimism, gradually kind of the people began to peel off in terms of optimists. David Remnick, now the editor-in-chief of the New Yorker, was among those. He was a Washington Post bureau chief and wrote, obviously, great work on Russia. And I got to know him during that period of time because we were both there. He and I at one point had a conversation which we said, we're the last of the optimists. Now, I haven't talked to David in many years now, but I'm not sure he's an optimist anymore. And I'm not sure I'm an optimist anymore. But we held out as long as we could. So it really, I'd like to believe there are lessons, but I'm nervous that there's an infection that the leadership in Russia, that Putin has kind of put into or maybe tapped into is the way to say it, that I think makes it harder. If there is a lesson that I would broadly frame, though, the point of that book was to say that the answer to building legal culture or legal structures, to building law in the former Soviet Union, in Russia and other former Soviet republics, as well as Central Europe, was not to put in place structures and institutions, or at least not only that. Because at the end of the day, the fundamental need was to build the legal consciousness, probably a saznание in Russian, the legal consciousness that would undergird those institutions. Because in the absence of that legal consciousness, the institutions would never take hold, take root, whatever. In some sense, that whatever that was, you could say the current moment proves that to be right. Although my optimistic count, if I can still do it, is we can go back to that, right? So what are the fundamental values, civilizational values, cultural values, global values that are there? I mean, they are in Russian culture, in Russian values, in Russian history, in Russian literature, in Russian religious belief, that we can find ways to tap into, that draw out, not overnight, not immediately, but draw out again that perspective on the world that I think Putin has managed to effectively, push down, right? In place of this nativist, nationalistic, atavistic kind of worldview that currently is motivating Russian policy. Now, I wanted to say one other important caveat. We should always be careful about equating leadership with the public, with the general population, with the general citizenry. So I'm sensitive to that. I don't think the general Russian citizenry is, at least if they had good information, would be aligned with Putin. But I do think that what he has done is he has created a cultural mindset that is receptive to that if we can unwind some of that, the policy piece and the political piece follows more readily.
Thanks. Now, there's next to your shovel in the office, a piece of calligraphy, and it says lawyer.
Yeah.
In Chinese characters. So China, of course, is another big thing that people are thinking about. Tell us about that piece of calligraphy, and also why your personal and professional connections with China.
Sure. So first point of connection comes, my wife, Krista, grew up in Portland, Oregon, where most of her friends were Asian. She, from the time she was a kid, loved Asia, was fascinated by Asia. She went to university at Georgetown, and at Georgetown she learned Japanese and spent some time living in Japan. And then after college, spent some time living in China before then getting her master's degree in Asian history at Yale, and continuing her Chinese studies. She then, in later years, has worked with schools that want to introduce Asian studies into their curriculum. So Chinese, Japanese, but also Asian history, Tai Chi, and whatever it is that she helps them kind of develop and teach those courses and build out that curriculum. So Krista was kind of one strand of connectivity to China. That we went there. I went to visit her, part of our courtship before our marriage. She was living in China, and so went to visit her. She tested me on many Chinese holy mountains to see if I had the constitution to survive, and almost did not, I might note. So
you mean climbing those mountains?
Huashan, yeah. Huashan in particular, she forced me to climb, because she's from Oregon and I'm from New York City. And I said, like, the difference in Oregon, you climb mountains. In New York, you take elevators up them. So that was the initial connection. And then particularly when I was at Emory, we built lots of partnerships with China and had lots of Chinese students. And so I was back and forth to China probably 2 or 3 times a year during my latter half of my time at Emory. And the last connection is we have, as I mentioned earlier, our daughter, our 11-year-old daughter, is from Taiwan. She would emphasize very strongly that she's from Taiwan, not from China, but we'll leave that for another day. But so we have her in the house as well. So lots of connections to China, and I think it's a fascinating place. Obviously, politically, as you suggest at the moment, interesting. But again, if you look at the history, the culture, it's just an incredibly interesting place, and I've enjoyed so much getting to know it over the years.
And as dean, how do you manage the political tensions while at the same time trying to grow partnerships with China?
So, with difficulty, so what I would say is, again, and the difficulties are different places at different times. So at Emory had a long time relationship with the Dalai Lama. And so whenever I would do anything in China, I would be interrogated on, why does Emory support the Dalai Lama? And I said, look, this is a historical program we've had. It has value in these ways. It's actually good for China. Yeah, I'm not sure they ever believed me, but again, they articulated those. And likewise now, there's obviously around geopolitical tensions, there's lots of questions. What I have done my best to do consistently is to be an advocate for mutual education and learning. And of course, you could do that with cautions and care and the like. But I do think fundamentally, disengagement from the largest country in the world, a country that geopolitically, unquestionably, is, if not at least among, if not one of the 2 most powerful countries in the world, I think is problematic. And those interactions happening not just at the level of military leadership or presidential leadership or ministerial levels, but among the population as a whole, academics, scientists, researchers, lawyers. I think that's critically important to the long-term vitality of both countries. And that doesn't mean that there won't be tensions in the interest between the 2 countries. But look, as academics, our job is to try and step back and offer perspective. And I think that perspective is hard to dispute. It's hard to construct any world in which lack of communication, lack of engagement, lack of understanding between China and the US is consistent with the best interests of the globe or even each of the individual countries.
Thanks. So last question for you. How do you maintain a work-life balance?
Great. So this probably is of all of them, this is one that I say, do as I say, not as I do. I probably don't do as good about, don't achieve as good a balance as I would. So, but I'll take a few things that come to mind. One, as I mentioned earlier, that one of the most important things to know about me is the importance of my family. So I have tried, I think, with relative success, to make engage time with my children, time with my wife, time with my family, being present for things that are important, a centerpiece of what I do. Now, not always successfully. It is the case that sometimes I miss the soccer goal or the match point because I'm responding to an email. So I don't want to in any way suggest, lest they watch this, that I was misleading. But I try to at least be there as much as possible. So that's one thing. And I would encourage that on everyone, because those moments really won't come again, right? So if you miss them, you miss them. And there's no recreating. So that's one thing. 2 is, I think it's important that in any leadership position that you not impose your practices on those who work for you, right? So I do my best to make it very clear to those from my work that even if on Easter, given the moment we're at right now, or even if on a Saturday or whatever else it is, that I'm busy doing something, I don't expect them to be doing so, right? That doesn't mean that they're not permitted to use it. If that's what their lives call for, they can do it. But I want to make sure that they're not doing it to satisfy me, right? That I don't expect that of them, and I understand that will mean, this is the time for everything. So I do think imposing, asking for that, I think is important. And the last thing I'd say is that, and again, this clearly is a do as I say, not as I do, although I try to do some of it. I would tell those who are prone in my direction, it's my experience that you will achieve your goals. You will be better at your job. You will do your job better if you take the time with regularity to recharge. if you have times during the week when you say, I'm not doing anything, right? Email is off, computer is off, papers are put aside, whatever else it is. Likewise, if periodically, this is in the summer, if you can find a way for a week or 2 weeks to be able to do that, or longer to do that, it's not just, it's good for your health. I actually think it's good for your work, right? I think you will be more entrepreneurial, more creative, more capable of managing stress, better at dealing with others. So that's the one other thing I would say is that, again, people should not fall into the trap of thinking of work-life balance as life is important and work is important. Even if you think only work is important, it turns out that recharging and doing these things will ensure that you do that much better.
Thanks so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope that, and I trust that our viewers will get as much out of this as I had, and a lot of fun. Thank
I
you so
enjoyed,
much.
yeah, it was fun. Great set of topics. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.